We're here in Midland at the Ashland Court Hotel celebrating the 25th anniversary season of the Matrix Midland Festival, a festival that takes place starting in mid-May to roughly mid-June every year. During the 25-year history, this festival has presented more than 325 events, performers, artists, writers, scientists, science fiction buffs, writers' conferences that had never been in our area. With me today is Rachel Naomi Remen, the Matrix speaker, and we want to thank her for being part of Matrix, and we want to thank her for being part of Uncommon Sense. With your life experience, especially in recent years, dealing with so many of the hardest times in life, people who are seriously ill, facing death, what have people told you about the value of living, or what they have learned, or what they'd like to share with others who are now on the path of life?
Well, you know, it's quite surprising. I've worked with people with cancer now for 25 years, and in all those years, no one has ever said to me, if I die of this illness, I'm going to miss my Mercedes. Even if the Mercedes has been the whole thrust of their life, and the lifestyle that the Mercedes represents has been the whole purpose of their life. People with cancer, many of them seem to have discovered something that the rest of us don't know, which is that the Mercedes may be the booby prize in life. It's not what's important at the edge of life. That at the edge of life you realize that what seems important is what you've left behind you in the hearts of other people, how you have changed their lives, served them, strengthened them. That's where our immortality lies.
That's really interesting, because oftentimes people will say it's what they left behind and interpret that to be some project or some artist's piece or something like that. Not what you said, which is to leave it in the hearts of people.
In the hearts of people. You know, I've had a patient who was also a colleague, a woman doctor, whose father is a very famous architect. And he was also a very tough father. She was never good enough for him, even though she's a very accomplished woman. And he was so critical of her that in her 20s she moved 3,000 miles away from him and very rarely went back to visit him. So when he was dying, she almost didn't go back to see him. And at the last moment, she decided she would go. And she found there a man she had never met, a completely different father. And she had 24 hours to sit with him and talk with him. And in this, she said to him, "Dad, what is it that you're leaving behind you that makes you feel it's all worth it?" And she was sure that he was going to say one of his many award-winning, very famous buildings. And without a second's hesitation, he said to her, "Why, you, of course." And she had never had a single word of praise from him in all of her life, but she feels that this became the foundation of her future. You know, the view from the edge of life is different than the view most of us have. It's wiser, it's simpler, it's more accessible to all of us. What really matters is much more accessible to all of us than the Mercedes is.
When you say the influence or going into the heart of another person by impact, give us a few examples, or perhaps so people could really understand what that means.
What it means to offer someone else an unconditional love, the listening which helps people hear themselves, recognize their own strength, the belief in themselves. I have so many stories about this. I was just thinking of a story of a medical student told me recently about his grandparents. He had been grieving their death, and because he wouldn't allow himself to cry, he hadn't been thinking about them much. And he'd been struggling with a problem on exams. He could never remember the things he knew. And so he was actually failing out of medical school, even though he had studied and he actually knew the material. And he told me something quite powerful. I had just sat with him and listened to him and gave him permission to cry about the loss of his grandparents. And he told me right after the session in which he wept for the first time. And all I did was listen and just pass him Kleenex. He had gone into an exam and sat down and looked at the first question. And he knew the answer to it an hour ago, but he couldn't. He just had nothing. And as he panicked, he thought about all the different ways he had tried to work with this, and tried some self-hypnosis, and he tried to do a little breath relaxation. Nothing helped. And suddenly he remembered that he used to sit between his grandparents on the front seat of a truck. And he was the only grandchild that was allowed to do this. And the memory came back to him very strongly. He could actually hear the dog running in the flatbed of the truck, and he could smell the woolly smell of the fabric. He said it was almost like an experience instead of a memory, and he could smell Grandma's floury talcum powder, and he knew he was safe. He knew that no matter what happened, he was loved and he was valued. And he looked back at the paper and he knew the answer to that question, so he wrote it down, and then he looked at the next question and he knew the answer to that one too, and he wrote it down. And he said because he had not had permission to cry, he couldn't remember. He wouldn't allow himself to remember them, because if he remembered them, he would cry. But because I had given him permission to cry just by listening to him, he could remember not only the sadness of losing them, but he could remember everything else as well. He could reclaim their love and belief. And all I did was listen to him.
But you must have listened deeply, fully.
From the heart.
From the heart.
From the heart. I don't listen in order to understand or fix people. Most people are broken. I listen in order to be with people, to just share their life experience. And I'm a little in awe, generally, of how strong most people are, how courageous, how many things we face, how many heroes there are in this world. Much more than we realize.
When you say people are broken,
people are not broken.
Are not broken.
Yeah.
Okay. They experience themselves some way as restricted, like he couldn't take the exam, right? He could not remember, right? And what I also hear is you're talking about safety, and what gave safety to him was love.
It's the only thing that gives safety. It's the only thing that gives meaning to life as well. Our possessions don't give meaning to life. At the end of our lives, we are satisfied with our lives, not because of what we've accumulated, but because of who we have loved and how deeply we have loved them. That's what matters.
But it sounds like it's also the reciprocal, too, because he loved his grandparents, but he benefited or needed or was a whole person because they loved him.
But look at the power of that. I mean, these people are dead, and their love still has the power to affect others in this world.
Right. Some people, though, don't have grandparents or don't have parents. They've come from very fractured environments where love is rare. Have you any thoughts or experience of working with people like those, and how they can bring that sense of lovingness into their lives?
It's a very strange thing to you. Everyone who has managed to survive has had enough love somewhere that has allowed them to do that. And often when I'm working with people who are disadvantaged, part of the work would be to find where that love was. And I remember very vividly a young man from the projects in San Francisco who had had an abusive childhood, a terrible, terrible life. And as we were talking about this, what he realized is the love that had kept him alive, that had kept him knowing that his life was of value, came from his dog. That he would come home from school, both his parents would be drunk, And the dog would rush to meet him, and through that relationship, he knew that his life mattered.
There's something about I guess what I'm searching for is, if there are no dogs and if there are no people, is it enough for the person to be able to love a flower or a picture, or must it always be like interpersonally with another person, that somebody said something nice or cared,
well, I
or on an even regular basis?
We're not talking about someone loving. We're talking about someone being loved, being valued.
Right. So
and
that's
you know,
where it starts.
sometimes it's a teacher, sometimes it's a neighbor, sometimes it's something very small, like the school bus driver says, "Good morning, how are you?" with a smile to a child. That can make all the difference. You would be amazed how small things like this can matter in a person's life. Yeah.
But it's also in my life, what I find is people say things, and sometimes they say it just the moment I need to hear it,
Yes.
or just the moment I'm ready to hear it, or just the moment I'm ready to think about it, and it could be an ambient person, someone I don't even know.
Absolutely.
I'm talking with at a bus stop or
Absolutely.
something like that, and it's like they gave me the wisdom moment.
Isn't it wonderful? There is a web of connection between us, and we have blessed the lives of many more people than we realize. We can bless the life of total strangers. And I can tell you a very funny story about that, if you would care to hear it.
Please.
It's a story that was also told by a colleague of mine. She had been in, her expertise is domestic violence, spouse abuse. And I once asked her how she got involved in this field, and she said she had been an abused wife, that her first husband had been a pillar of the community, a lawyer, and had always treated her with deep respect in public, so no one suspected that her private life was literally a living hell. And he had told her, like most abusers, that it was all her fault, that he was treating her like this because of stupid things she said and did, and she would try harder and harder. It was never enough. And so after 8 years of this, she had come to believe him, that she did deserve to be treated in this way, and she was this stupid woman. And all of this ended one day on a street corner in New York City. They were visiting. And they're standing there waiting for the light to change. And she looks across the street and she sees a beautiful building, and she says to him, "Honey, look at the beautiful building." And he, thinking they're alone, speaks to her in the tone of utter contempt that he used in private. And he says to her, "You mean the yellow building, the one that anyone with a brain in their head would know is just like every other building on the street?" And she just fell silent, which is how she treated these humiliating remarks. But a total stranger, a woman who's waiting for the light to change, turned to him in disbelief and said, "What? She's absolutely right. It's a perfectly beautiful building. And you, sir, are a horse's ass." Right? And then the light changed. And this total stranger went across the street, went on with her life. But Elaine says in that moment her whole life changed. She knew without a question that she'd never deserved this treatment. She understood what had gone on in this marriage. And she also felt something very unfamiliar in her, which is that she felt a kind of, as she described it, a strength. And she knew it would take time and planning, but she's going to be able to leave him. She knew it right there on the street corner.
Because she saw another world.
She saw something.
Right.
But the thing that's so key about this is that it's not a story about her. It's a story about the stranger. Because if we were to go to New York and find her and say, "Have you ever saved anyone's life?" I don't think she'd say, "Yes, 20 years ago on that street corner waiting for the light to change." I don't think she'd say that. I think she'd say, "What are you talking about? I'm not a doctor. I don't save lives." But the fact is, we all save lives, and we have all blessed many more people than we know. We have great power.
I had a little experience like that. I was in a supermarket once in line, and this woman was really humiliating her young daughter. And I leaned over to the daughter and I said, "Not all adults are like that." and I thought, I don't know, but may that be
You
her
never
gift
know.
for the day.
But you know, often we do things and we're not even aware of the impact.
Right.
You know, we have helped many more people than we realize. Yeah.
I want to thank Rachel Naomi Remen for being with us today. What she has shared with us is very important. What she has basically said is things really at the end of life don't count, even though in the process of life they're very important to you. And what's important really is actually where you have gone into people's hearts and ultimately where they have gone into yours. And the way you do that is by listening and being there and being probably quiet while they talk or they cry. She also mentioned the importance of having some loving presence that you can draw on in your life. Could be an aunt, a parent, a dog even in this last story, someone who was an ambient person who came into your life just at a stoplight, and that you can treasure those moments and they can really give you a strength and a clarity about your own life. And extending that point is the point that we never know how we're going to influence people. So it is almost incumbent on us to give out perhaps a little bit and just wish another person well when we see something happen. So I would say that why wait till you're at the end of life to learn this? Why not practice it now? And I invite you to do that. And as you know, I end every show with remember, kindness counts. And I have one last question for Dr. Remen. We have been talking on the verbal level, right? Have you any thoughts about the nonverbal level and their effect on others or others' effect on us?
I think some of the most important things are communicated nonverbally. The things we trust the most from other people, we get nonverbally. And I think simply a touch or an encouraging pat or things that don't take much time can have a huge impact on other people. We don't know our own power, you know. We don't know our power to affect other people. And I think it would be good if we understood it more, because then we could use it more deliberately. Yeah. Yeah.
What Dr. Remen is really saying here is that we're much more full, we're much more complete as people. Not only are we not broken, but we have the capacity perhaps to heal others in ways we may not be thinking of, but we can do it at many levels. We can do it at the verbal level, we can do it at the touch level, and we can do it by our attitude. So again, I remember, kindness counts, and remember that bracket's now a lot of activity. See you next time, and thank you for tuning in.